Welcome to Truth Watchers. I'm Heath Henning. We're going to take a historical look at the Olympics today. I have found it interesting that Christians are currently complaining about the trans reenactment of the Last Supper, which was performed as a mockery to Christianity. People are acting like this is controversial, but if people were knowledgeable about history, they would realize what is truly controversial is that Christians are actually watching and enjoying the Olympic Games. In reality, this topic goes beyond the Olympics to the common sports entertainment, such as football, baseball, or whatever sports people watch. I'm not going to spend much time introducing the topic. I'm just going to jump right into sharing quotes from ancient Jewish and Christian sources. Now, the current issue of Christianity being preoccupied with sports is due to the 1820s when Christianity pushed against the effeminate fads of that generation. They promoted growing beards and playing sports to be manly. If you look at Christian men from the 1700s, they wore long hair wigs and the clothing was tight knickers, which is just short, skinny pants. This portion of history all has its backdrop, which we will not discuss here because we're going straight to the earliest sources, the Jewish roots and the Christians of the earliest centuries. We can start in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls are silent about sports or such forms of entertainment because the Jewish culture was not involved with these types of games. It was viewed as a pagan practice, which was rejected by Jews. And as we will see, when Christianity rose up, they carried the same opinion, which is why I said it's controversial that Christians today watch this garbage. My whole point in this study is to show that the people of God historically had rejected these things, and it is a mark of apostasy that Christianity today accepts them. We find in 1 Maccabees chapter 1 verses 11 through 15 a comment that shows how sports were introduced into the Jewish nation as part of the apostasy, forsaking the covenant with God by incorporating pagan practices in their culture. Quote, "In those days went there out of Israel wicked men who persuaded many, saying, Let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are around about us. For since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. Since this device pleased them well, then certain of the people were so forward herein that they went to the king, who gave them license to do after the ordinances of the heathen, wherein they built a place of exercise at Jerusalem according to the custom of the heathen, and made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to do mischief." Here we read about the introduction of the Hellenization of the Jewish nation. It mentions they built a place of exercise, which in the Greek is the word gymnasium, which we get our English word gymnasium. In Greek, the root word gumnos means naked, stripped, bare. In the ancient Greek culture, the games were played in complete nudity, which was offensive to the Jews and the Christian concept of modesty. Today, these athletes may have clothes on, but their clothing is so tight it's practically skin. You can see every crack and crease of skin on their bodies. Christians today are so ignorant about true modesty because they are desensitized by the heathen culture and clothing we see every day as we go out in public. Most Christians wear the exact same style the rest of the world. In reality, tight is skin. Tight clothes leaves nothing to the imagination. Christians need to stop following the fashions and fads of the world. Christians should be disgusted and offended by athletes or people in public wearing something so tight you can see everything that should be covered up. Josephus mentions how King Herod the Great would after bring these heathen customs into Israel. In his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus relates in Book 15, Chapter 8, quote, "On this account it was that Herod revolted from the laws of his country and corrupted their ancient constitution by the introduction of foreign practices, which constitution yet ought to have been preserved inviolable, by which means we became guilty of great wickedness afterward, while those religious observances which used to lead the multitude to piety were now neglected. For in the first place he appointed solemn games to be celebrated every 5th year, in honor of Caesar and built a theater at Jerusalem, as also a very great amphitheater in the plain. Both of them were indeed costly works, but opposite to the Jewish customs. For we have had no such shows delivered down to us as fit to be used or exhibited by us. Yet did he celebrate these games every 5 years in the most solemn and splendid manner. He also made proclamation to the neighboring countries and called men together out of every nation, the wrestlers also, and the rest of those that strove for the prizes in such games were invited out of every land, both by the hopes of the rewards there to be bestowed, and by the glory of victory to be there gained. Unquote. He states a little further down, quote, not only to those that performed their exercises naked, but to those that played the musicians also and were called themiliki. The term themiliki refers to music meetings, or what we would call concerts. This shows there was always identified a difference between godly music and pagan music, which would offend the people of God. That is to be a rebuke to many churches playing contemporary Christian music, so-called Christian rock or whatever. Josephus goes on to mention chariot races and has much comments about the trophies, which he equated to idols. He includes the statement, quote, but to natural Jews, this was no better than a dissolution of these customs for which they had so great a veneration, unquote, indicating that the games were opposed to Jewish customs. The footnote added by the translator William Whiston is also interesting. He stated, quote, these grand plays and shows and themically, or music meetings and chariot races, etc., were still, as we see here, looked on by the sober Jews as heathenish sports, intending not only to corrupt the manner of the Jewish nation and to bring them in love with paganish, idolatry, and pagan conduct of life, but to the dissolution of the law of Moses. Nor is the case of our modern masquerades, plays, operas, and the like pomps and vanities of this wicked world of any better tendency under Christianity. Unquote. Whiston, who wrote these words, was a successor of Isaac Newton as professor of mathematics at Cambridge in the early 1700s. That gives a little more light on the historical view of sports and entertainment among Christianity throughout history. Obviously, he was rebuking Christians enjoying sports, but scholars and influential leaders were opposed to it until the 1800s when those views changed. Josephus also mentions Herod completing and building in time for the 192nd Olympiad. I should mention the first Olympiad was from July 776 to June 775 BC and held every 4 years. So it was used in the ancient world as part of the calendar to calculate chronology. So the 192nd Olympiad would correspond to Herod's 28th year of reigning, according to Josephus. He writes about this in the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 16, Chapter 5, saying, quote, there was accordingly a great festival and most sumptuous preparations made presently in order to its dedication, for he had appointed a contention in music and games to be performed naked. He had also gotten ready a great number of those that fight single combats and of beasts from the like for the like purpose, horse races also, and the most chargeable of such sports and shows as used to the exhibit at Rome and in other places. He consecrated this combat to Caesar and ordered it to be celebrated every 5th year. Philo, in his work on rewards and punishment, 52, says, quote, now this man was proclaimed as conqueror and crowned as such in the sacred contests. And when I speak of sacred contests, I do not mean those which are accounted such by other nations, for they are in reality unholy, affixing as they do rewards and honors to acts of violence and insolence and injustice instead of very extremity of punishment, which the rights belongs to them. but I mean rather such as the soul is by nature formed to go through, which by means of prudence drives away folly and wicked cunning, and by temperance drives away prodigality and stinginess, and by courage drives away both rashness and cowardice, and the other vices which are in direct opposition and respective virtues, and which are of no use either to themselves or to anyone else. So Philo used sports as an illustration on competing for holiness and righteousness in our lives, but condemned the actual sports that he was using as an analogy. In his book titled On Husbandry, 113 through 114, he says, quote, "Therefore, in all these unholy contests, surrender the prizes to others, but as for those which are really holy, study yourself to gain the crown in them. And think not those contests holy which the different cities propose in their triennial festivals, when they build theaters and receive many myriads of people. For in those, he who has overthrown anyone in wrestling, or who has cast him on his back or on his face upon the ground, or he who is very skillful in wrestling or in the pancratium, carries off the first prize, though he may be a man who has never abstained from any wicked or violence or of injustice. There are some men, again, who having armed and strongly fortified both their hands in a most hard and terrible manner, like iron, attack their adversaries and batter their heads and faces and the other parts of their bodies. And whenever they are able to plant a blow, they inflict great fractures and then claim the decision in their favor and a crown of victory by means of their merciless cruelty." Unquote. In 116 through 117 of the same book, he writes, quote, "Of all these contests, then, there is not one which is truly sacred. No, not though all the men in the world should combine to bear witness in their favor, but they must be convicted by themselves of bearing false witness if they do so. For they who admire these things have established laws against men who behave with insolent violence, and have affixed punishments to assaults, and have appointed judges to decide on every action of that kind. How then is it natural for the same persons to be indignant at those who insult and assault other privately, and to establish in their cases punishment which cannot be avoided, but yet in the case of those who commit these assaults publicly and in assemblies of the people and in theaters, to establish by law that they shall receive crowns, and that proclamation shall be made in their honor in all sports and other glorious circumstances." Unquote. One of the few comments that expresses a morally neutral position, at very least, it is not explicitly condemning sports, is found in the pseudepigraphal text Testament, the Testament of Abraham, chapter 10, wherein he is taken in a chariot by an angel to see events of the world. During this journey, he is said to observe some, quote, dancing and sporting and playing the zither. In other places, they were wrestling and pleading at law, unquote. Considering other Jewish texts of the era, this should be understood as Abraham was observing events that were viewed as sinful. Obviously, the Jewish culture became infiltrated by these sports, and they eventually had to develop their laws in appliance with them. So in the Mishnah, composed around AD 200, but based on the traditions of earlier ages dealing with legal issues, we find a discussion about if an ox gore a person. Normally, the ox gore and kills a person, it was to be put to death. But the Mishnah relates in Baba Kama 3:4, quote, "An ox from the stadium is not liable to be put to death if it causes death, for it is written, if an ox gore, and not if it be made to gore." Unquote. In other words, the bulls are trained in the stadium to attack men, so they are not liable to be killed for doing what they were trained to do if one gets loose. In another place, Abodazara 1:7, it dictates what a Jew can sell or be hired by Gentiles for work. It says, quote, "None may sell them bears or lions or aught that can do harm to people. None may help them build a basilica, scaffold, stadium, or judge's tribunal. But one may help to build public baths or bath houses. Yet when they reach the vaulting where they set up the idol, it is forbidden to help them to build." Unquote. As we move towards later rabbinic sources, the work titled Pesikta di Rab Kahanan in Pisgah 15:2, a commentary on the verse of Jeremiah 15:17, which states, quote, "Rabbi Abba bar Kahana began his discourse with the verse, I sat not in the assembly of them that make merry, nor rejoiced. I sat solitary because of thy hand," Jeremiah 15:17. The congregation of Israel said to the Holy One, "Master of the universe, in obedience to thee, never have I gone into the theaters and circuses of the nations of the earth, nor have I made merry and rejoiced with them." Unquote. Another passage in Pisgah 28:1, a contrast between heathen gathering and a gathering in the synagogue is being made. Here it says, quote, another comment, "Thou hast increased the nations." Isaiah, referring to Isaiah 26:15. "It is the way of the nations of the earth when thou increasest holidays for them, that they eat, drink, and carouse, and attend their theaters and circuses, and provoke thee with their utterances and their deeds." Unquote. Another ancient rabbinic text is the 2-volume work titled Pesikta Rabbati, which in one passage relates the account of Joseph, who being sold into slavery into Egypt and is working for Potiphar. The passage simply refers to him as diligent at work based on Genesis 39:11, which says, "And it came to pass on a certain day that Joseph went into the house to do his work." This comment is elaborated with the comment, quote, "According to Rabbi Nehemiah, however, the certain day was a day of entertainment in the theater and the circus." Unquote. That comment is made to explain why no other people were in the house and Potiphar's wife was alone with Joseph to attempt to seduce him. It is implied that Joseph was not attending the theater and circus because he was a Jew who avoided these heathen activities and entertainments. The same passage is referenced in Genesis Rabbah with the comment, quote, "It was a day of a theatrical performance which all flocked to see," unquote. And a commentary on Song of Songs, known as Song of Songs Rabbah, opens with the comment in the same passage saying, quote, "Rabbi Judah says, it was a day on which idolatrous sacrifice was offered. It was a day of theatrical performances." Rabbi Nehemiah says, it was a day of theatrical performances to or in honor of the Nile, unquote. In the 10-volume set of Midrash Rabbah, which are rabbinic commentaries on the Torah and a few other books, including Ruth, Esther, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, in Genesis Rabbah, we are told, Rabbi Levi said, 6 organs serve a man, over 3 he is a master, and over 3 he is not. Over the eye, ear, and nose he is not master, for he sees that he does not wish to see, hear, and smells what he does not wish to hear and smell. Over the mouth, hand, and foot he is master. If he desires, he studies the Torah. Well, if he wishes to engage in slander, and if he wishes, he blasphemes and reviles. With the hand, he can dispense charity if he wishes, while he can rob and murder if he so desires. With his feet, he can go to the theaters and circuses, while, if he wishes, he can go to synagogues and houses of study. Unquote. In Exodus Rabbah 51:8, the collection of gold for the golden calf idol was likened to a young man who gave to a collection for a theater. Quote, "Further on his travels, he lighted on a place where they were collecting for a theater, and when asked to contribute towards it, he was also so generous that he had to be told enough. Israel likewise contributed so much toward the golden calf that they had to be told enough." unquote. In Leviticus Rabbah 13:3, the saints will watch Behemoth and Leviathan engage in a battle as a reward for not watching wild beast contests of the heathen theaters. It states, quote, as whoever has not been a spectator at the wild beast contest of the heathen nations in this world will be accorded the boon of seeing one in the world to come, unquote. Another passage depicts the common practice of leading criminals around the grounds of these events to bring public shame. It says, quote, whosoever will gather and eat of the fruits of the 7th year will be led around the public sports ground, unquote. It then speaks of a woman who was embarrassed being led around the sports ground because she feared people would think she was guilty of an immoral act or witchcraft. Another passage reflects the theaters and circuses as places of idolatry, specifically mentioning statues of the kings that were erected. Lamentations Rabbah says, quote, the community of Israel spake before the Holy One, blessed be he, sovereign of the universe. Never did I enter the theaters and circuses of the heathen people and make merry and rejoice. In section 17, Psalm 69:12 is quoted, they that sit in the gate speak against me, and I was the song of the drunkard, followed by the comment, quote, this refers to the nations of the world who sit in the theaters and circuses, unquote. It then relates how the heathen ridiculed Jews in the theaters in the rest of the paragraph. This same passage is repeated in a later section, only changing slightly with the description of how the Jews are ridiculed in the theaters, wherein one of the ways in the early passage refers to heathens using a corpse with a shaved head, while the later passage says it is a clown with a shaved head. Another portion refers to a location in the Mount of Olives, which was destroyed because, according to Rabbi Huna, quote, the reason was because they used to play a game with ball on Sabbath, unquote. In Ruth Rabbah 2:21, the comment is made, quote, my daughter, it is not the custom of daughters of Israel to frequent Gentile theaters and circuses, unquote. Ecclesiastes Rabbah expresses the theaters as an unclean place, grouping it along with privies, that is a bathroom. Rabbi Josi ben Halafta makes the comment to a woman, quote, if the Holy One, blessed be he, gave wisdom to fools, they would sit and meditate upon it in privies, theaters, bathhouses. But the Holy One, blessed be he, gave wisdom to the wise to sit and meditate upon it in synagogues and houses of study, unquote. In chapter 2, Rabbi Abba ben Kahana says, quote, how confounded, senseless is the laughter in which the heathen people indulge in their circuses and theaters, unquote. In Esther Rabbah, a brief comment is made, quote, Rabbi Huna and Rabbi Phinehas explain even the things with which royalty entertains itself, such as theaters and circuses, the city endures, unquote. So it's obviously a harmful thing for a city to have such things. The early Christians had many more comments about condemning the theaters and sporting events, of which I will only share a few for the sake of time. This should be obvious because Christians converting out of Gentile cultures were more familiar with these sports and games. All these quotes are from the 10-volume set of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. Clement of Alexandria provided perhaps the most favorable and balanced comment concerning sports. He writes, quote, and even for men to prefer gymnastic exercises by far to the baths is perchance not bad, since they are in some respects conducive to the health of young men, and produce exertion, emulation to aim at not only a healthy habit of body, but courageousness of soul. When this is done with dragging a man away from better employments, it is pleasant and not unprofitable, nor are women to be deprived of bodily exercise. But they are not to be encouraged to engage in wrestling or running, but are to exercise themselves in spinning and weaving and superintending and cooking if necessary. And reading aloud is often an exercise to many, But let not such athletic contests as we have allowed be undertaken for the sake of vainglory, but for the exuding of manly sweat. Nor are we to straggle with cunning and showiness, but in the stand-up wrestling bout, by disentangling of necks, hands, and sides. For such a struggle with graceful strength is more becoming and manly, being undertaken for the sake of serviceable and profitable health. But let those others who profess to practice the illiberal postures in gymnastics be dismissed. We must always aim at moderation. Unquote. Now, much of what Clement says I agree with, in that as Christians we should exercise and be healthy, take care of the body God gave us. Gluttony is a sin, and the appearance of gluttony is a bad testimony to the world for a Christian. But even Clement of Alexandria noted the Olympics as idolatry and connected their origin to the pagan mystery religion. In his book Exhortation to the Heathen, he said, quote, at Nemea, a little boy, Archemorus, was buried, and the funeral games of the child are called Nemea. Pisa is the grave of the Phrygian charioteer. O Hellenes, of all tribes, in the Olympian games, which are nothing else than the funeral sacrifices of Pelops, the Zeus of Phidias claims for himself. The mysteries were then, as is probable, games held in honor of the dead, so also were the oracles, and both became public. Unquote. Tertullian wrote a book titled De Spectaculis, or in English, The Shows, in which he writes, quote, to the testimony of antiquity is added that of later games instituted in their turn, and betraying their origin from the titles which they bear even at the present day, in which it is imprinted as on their very face, for what idol and for what religious object games, whether of the one kind or the other, were designed. You have festivals bearing the name of the Great Mother, and Apollo, and Ceres, and Neptune, and Jupiter, and Lateris, and Flora, all celebrated for a common end, and others have their religious origin in the birthday of solemnity of kings, in public success, in municipal holidays. Unquote. He further states, quote, at first the theater was properly a temple of Venus, and to speak briefly, it was owing to this that stage performance were allowed to escape censor and got a footing in the world. Unquote. So Tertullian viewed the theater as idolatry, and because its origin was connected with what was sacred to paganism, it was able to go uncensored. He also comments, quote, are we not in like manner enjoined to put away from us all immodesty? On this ground, again, we are excluded from the theater, which is immodesty's own peculiar abode, where nothing is in repute but what elsewhere is disreputable. Unquote. As I mentioned in the beginning, the lack of clothing or the tight clothes worn in these events are immodest, and Christians should not enjoy looking on such immoral and immodest activities. Tertullian then follows with a strict rebuke to Christians who find pleasure in these events, saying, quote, does it then remain for us to apply to the heathen themselves? Let them tell us, then, whether it is right in Christians to frequent the show. Why, the rejection of these amusements is the chief sign to them that a man has adopted the Christian faith. If anyone then puts away the faith's distinctive badge, he is plainly guilty of denying it. When you go over to the enemy's camp, you throw down your arms, desert the standards and the oaths of allegiance to your chief. You cast in your lot for life or death with your new friends. Unquote. Cyprian says, quote, people flock thither to the public disgrace of the brothel for the teaching of obscenity, that nothing less may be done on secret than what is learnt in public. And in the midst of the laws themselves is taught everything that the laws forbid. What does a faithful Christian do among these things, since he may not even think upon wickedness? Why does he find pleasure in the representations of lust so as among them to lay aside his modesty and become more daring in crimes he is learning to do while he is becoming accustomed to see? Unquote. Lactantius writes in his work, The Divine Institute, quote, therefore all spectacles ought to be avoided, not only that no vice may settle in our breasts, which ought to be tranquil and peaceful, but in the habitual indulgence of any pleasures may not soothe and captivate us, and turn us aside from God and from good works. For the celebrations of the games are festivals in honor of the gods, inasmuch as they were instituted on account of their birthdays or the dedication of new temples. And at first, the huntings, which are called shows, were in honor of Saturnus, and the scenic games in honor of Liber, but the Circensian in honor of Neptune. But degrees, however, the same honor began to be paid also to other gods, and separate games were dedicated to their names. As Sicinius Capito teaches in his book on the games, therefore, if anyone is present at the spectacles to which men assemble for the sake of religion, he has departed from the worship of God and has betaken himself to those deities whose birthdays and festivals he has celebrated. Unquote. Another text titled The Apostolic Constitution states, quote, avoid also indecent spectacles, I mean the theaters and the pomps of the heathens, their enchantments, observations of omens, soothsayings, purgations, divinations, observations of birds, their necromancy and invocations. Unquote. This same text discusses those who are to be rejected for baptism unless they forsake their previous employments of activities. A lengthy list of such things include, quote, if one belonging to the theater come, whether it be man or woman, or charioteer, or dueler, or racer, or player of prizes, or Olympic gamester, or one that plays on the pipe, on the lute, or on the harp at those games, or a dancing master, or an huckster, either let them leave off their employment, or let them be rejected. Unquote. In brief, there's a long history of the people of God, whether Jews or Christians, to reject the Olympic Games and sports in general. This should not even be a controversy for us today. We should be moving to higher ground, learning from our history, growing in grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and each generation should be standing on the shoulders of the previous generation, growing in our holiness and personal walk with God. Instead, we see each generation becoming more compromised, more apostate. And this is part of what the Bible predicts about the end time apostasy. We should oppose this move towards apostasy, not befriend it. This is Heath Henning. Thank you for tuning in to Truth Watchers podcast. Remember to hit the subscribe button and share it with a friend. For more fascinating facts, check us out at truthwatchers.com, because sound apologetics and exegesis of scriptures is important for all of God's children, as it is indicated in 3 John verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth.